All right, welcome everyone. How fantastic. I'm so delighted to be with everyone. I'm Dani Klein Modisett, the founder and CEO of Laughter on Call. And we are here to take on a very timely issue, caring for the caregiver and avoiding burnout. And I'm going to introduce our guests, but I'm so fascinated that actually just this week, the New York Times had featured an article called The Quiet Rage of Caregivers. So there you go. Like, we couldn't be more timely in this conversation. And of course, comedians love timing. So very excited about that. I am going to introduce our guests. So we have with us today Sherri Snelling she's the CEO of the Caregiver Club and the author of Me Time Monday, which here it is right here. I do love to promote it because we're at Laughter on Calls actually in there too. Sherri and I met doing an episode of The Doctors together. So, and beyond that, she is a corporate gerontologist and an expertise in life course aging, which I have to ask you about because that's an interesting phrase. And she was recently recognized as one of the top 10 influencers on Alzheimer's by ShareCare. She is former chairman of the National Alliance for Caregiving, the leading caregiving advocacy nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. So yay. And we also have the wonderful Cynthia Hutchins, who I had the good fortune to meet last week at the Milken Conference in D.C. She is the director of financial gerontology at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. Now, what's interesting, Cynthia, I learned this about you and Merrill Lynch, that you did a caregiving training program in 2018 and a cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease training in 2017. So that's really a tribute to Merrill Lynch that they were running those. I think that's fantastic. And of course, we have the very talented Lindsey Flores here. She is the VP of Corporate Development for 18 years at Carlton Senior Living, probably not all those 18 years, but she has been there for 18 years, and a degree from the Yale School of Management, which I also didn't know. And we have worked with them and brought some connection and laughter to them. So that's super exciting. So yes, very grateful to have these very talented women and knowledgeable women here because the statistics are wild. Yes, they are. In that New York Times article, they stated around 53 million Americans are caregivers for a family member or friend with a health issue or disability. And nearly a third spend more than 20 hours or more a week in that role. And then there's just the Alzheimer's statistics that, according to the US Census, from now until 2030, 10,000 baby boomers will reach retirement age every day. Every day, 10,000 boomers every day, which is crazy. And by 2040, over 80 million people in the US will be over 65 years old, with that number growing to nearly 95 million by 2060. That's a lot of people. And currently, 9 million Americans could have dementia by 2030 and nearly 12 million by 2040. So there's all the backstory or the front story on what they're calling the silver tsunami and the ever-growing population of people, consequently, who will be caregivers. And so we need exactly what these women know all about. So just as a little hello, I'd love to ask each of you, like, how you ended up in this gerontology space. So Lindsey, why don't you go ahead?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for having me. I actually began working in assisted living as just an activities assistant, really leaning into, as Laughter on Call really prioritizes, just having fun with seniors. Had a completely different career path, but fell in love with that experience and just continued to grow within Carlton Senior Living for those 18 years that I've been with them. And really, I think we all can say that once we get to work with seniors, you really don't want to leave that space. It's very powerful and very, very special. And being able to make a difference and enjoy what you do every day is not something that you can get in every job. So that was my experience.
Fantastic. And Cynthia, how did you end up with the gerontology world?
Yeah, I would say I got here through my midlife crisis. I was the financial advisor for 20 years, and started to realize that the questions that clients were asking about retirement had changed dramatically from when I had started in my practice in the 80s. And so I went back to school and I earned a master's in gerontology. And if I can plug the University of Southern California, I'll do it all day long. So I earned a master's in gerontology, and we had some very forward-thinking leaders at Bank of America who found out what I was doing and decided to create a role for me.
That is fantastic. Yes. And Sherri, you're also a USC gerontology person, isn't that right?
I am. I think I went a little bit later than Cynthia because I went back and got my master's in gerontology after the age of 50. So lifelong learning, as we know, is part of longevity. But I actually started my career, if you can believe it, working for companies like Nintendo and Canon. So I was in kind of the consumer tech space. And about 20 years ago, I segued into family caregiving, working for the largest healthcare insurer on a program that was actually offered to employers. And so this was for, working employees who needed the benefits and the help and the resources as they were taking care of older loved ones. And then when I created Caregiving Club, I stayed really within that channel. My biggest clients are employers, and I do a lot of caregiver education. I'm also an author, as you mentioned, so that my second book just came out anytime Monday, and I do podcasts and a lot of content, I would say, and then also consulting. I consult for a lot of startups in age tech and also larger companies on different programs around understanding the aging population, aging customers, and also caregivers and what their needs are.
Fantastic. So yeah, caring for the caregiver, right? Like that's something that I'm very actively involved with, and I think all of us are actually. And so I'm just curious, in terms of this like burnout topic, right? Like what can employers and support companies do for employees who are caring for others outside of their jobs, those people that I mentioned at the top? And I know, Cynthia, why don't you talked a little bit about this with the at the Milken event about caring for people who are caring for others. So you can kick that off for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I would say that more and more employers are creating caregiving benefits within their benefits packages, and that's really, really important. There are some things that they can do that are a little no cost that really can help caregivers fight burnout. One is creating an employee resource group. I think that's super important so that employees who are in similar situations can get together and find solutions to their individual problems that they're experiencing. So that's something that is relatively low or no cost to an employer that can be done. And then on the other end, you can add different benefits that I would say sort of couple with those health insurance benefits that so many employers offer. Things like emergency backup care that can also be used for respite care. So the caregiver just needs a day at the spa, as an example. You can access that respite care in order to give yourself the day off, which is really important. And then there's some things that you might not think about, things like getting together within the community. Maybe there's a gym close by where the employer is located that they can negotiate a deal where their employees can go in there and work out and work off some of that stress. So, lots of different things across a very broad spectrum.
Yeah, I'm super curious. The emergency respite care, is that a fund that they tap into so that they can take the day off? Is that essentially what that is?
Well, it's more about originally as it's conceived is so that they don't take a day off, right? So that if there is a problem with an in-home caregiver, they can't get there for whatever reason, you can access that. However, so that's the emergency side of it, right? That's the backup care side of it. The respite care is you can access that same caregiver or that same caregiver company to come in and spend the day with your care recipient so that you can take the day off from caregiving.
Got it. Yes, we have also presented an employee benefit with 3 laughter on call sessions 3 half-hour sessions for your loved one to bring joy and comic relief and give the caregiver a break, some comic relief. So absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Sherri. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think what Cynthia said is so important. The employee resource groups are groups that I work with a lot to do workshops and different educational webinars. But I think what's really important for employers to recognize is the most recent studies show that 1 in 6 employees are caring for someone over the age of 50. 1 in 3 employees are caring for somebody. Now, that can include childcare. And there was a really great study that came out a few years ago from Harvard called The Caring Company. And it defined caregiving, particularly in the workplace, as anyone caring for someone of a younger age, a child, all the way through caring for parents and grandparents. And I like that redefinition because I think what it does is it starts to get us out of this segregation of childcare versus elder care. And it shows that caregiving is a constant throughout our lives and our working lives. We just have maybe different resources that we need, different, help and supports or whatever. So that becomes a really great definition to also help us prepare better as families. And one of the things that I think is important is, a lot of employers struggle because caregiving is not a one size fits all. There is not, just the 3 top things we're going to offer. Everybody has kind of different needs at different times. And so whether it's, workplace flexibility, whether it's the ERG groups, whether it's, as Cynthia said, the backup care, the respite care, I work with some companies that actually have a liaison that is within the HR department that liaises to help them find community resources. So there's a lot of different options for employers to look at, and certainly recognizing that more and more of the workforce is going to be encountering caregiving. It becomes vital if you're trying to attract people back to the workplace and to be loyal and stick with your employer. If you have these types of benefits in place, they're hard to walk away from.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely it affects retention. And also in all those statistics that I read at the top, like Alzheimer's, caregiving, it's going to touch every family. So employers really need to be sensitive to that. And Lindsey, I'm curious about at Carlton, what your experience has been with this.
Yeah, I think Cynthia and Sherri really touched on the main elements there. I would add, and Sherri brought this up for a moment, but I would add that the concept of flexibility for employees has really been very prevalent, especially during the pandemic. This has exploded as one of the top priorities for employees as they're looking for where they want to work. Can they have that flexibility? And oftentimes it is due to what we're talking about right now, which is in their personal life, they have more than just the job. They have maybe someone to care for, whether, as we said, that could be a parent, a loved one, a child. And unfortunately, especially looking at the assisted living world, historically, it's been a very structured shift type environment, and it does not have that flexibility. So over the last few years, Carlton has really tried to just think outside the box around how can we offer caregivers this flexibility within the shift so that they have that autonomy to make choices around when they come to work and when they're able to go and leave and take care of that loved one. If they need to, have that time in the evening, time in the morning, that we can move our operation around to accommodate that.
That's great. That's really
one thing, Dani, that we should bring up here, and that is, I mentioned the idea of partnering with a gym, right? But there's also the idea of taking care of your own mental health as a caregiver. And there are many employers, mine included, that offer an employee assistance program that will offer counseling. And that is a huge, huge benefit that many of our caregivers are not even aware exists within their firms where they work. And a lot of employers aren't aware of how beneficial that could be for their working caregivers.
Yeah, absolutely. Which calls to mind this question that I have of like, if there's one thing that you could change either in your place of employment or in the culture at large about the perception of caregiving, I'm curious what that might be. But yeah, that was like kind of the beginning of that answer, Cynthia, that just being informed, just informing your people. And of course, that would mean reducing the stigma around mental health, just not even Alzheimer's problems, but actually all mental health. So promoting that, I see. But yes, Sherri, I feel like you have an answer
I
for it.
do. I'm like, that was a great question. No, to just follow up on what Cynthia was saying, I think one of the things I'm looking forward to, and it's starting to happen a little bit, is again, this redefinition of caregiver. It's really a life constant, right? We start out being cared for, we end life being cared for, and then in between, we form caring relationships. And it just depends on the age and stage of life that we're at, but it's a constant. And to not ignore the elder care perspective of that life course. You mentioned, what is life course? Well, it's just basically looking over your life journey and what are the things that are going on. I think the other thing too is around education, which is really where I'm focused a lot. And it's, the more information we can get to caregivers that will help them out, because very often when I do workshops or webinars, caregivers don't know, oops, sorry. I lost my mic there for a minute. Drop my mic. Caregivers don't know what they don't know. And so the more education that we can bring into the workplace, and also educate the managers and the C-suite about, what's happening within their workforce, I think all of those things become really important. And then lastly, I'll just touch upon my focus in gerontology is around neuroscience and brain health. And that's really what my new book is about, is how do we find that balance in life, which is really what burnout is about. It's about having a lack of balance in our lives. How do you find that balance? And what does that mean in terms of your brain and understanding how your brain works, understanding that we need multisensory activities, being out in nature is really helpful. So little simple things that we can do, but also using different language around caregiving. Very often I feel like we use crisis words, even the words like silver tsunami or burnout, everything is so dreadful. It's like when you become a caregiver, it's dreadful language. I hope that we can kind of spin this, and I don't want to be a Pollyanna, but let's take a more positive approach. And so rather than maybe banishing burnout, how do we help you build your strengths to bring balance back into your life? It's just a subtle change, but what it does when we're starting to talk to each other and think these things through, it puts a more positive aspect on, this is a role we're all going to play, and we don't want to go into it like being dragged and I don't want to do this, right? I mean, it is something that can actually bring a lot of gifts to people as well, and their silver lining. So we don't want to forget that positive aspect of it, I think.
I'm totally laughing because we're like laughter on call, and I'm the one that's talking about burnout and like silver tsunami, so
laughter is one of our tools, right? I mean, bringing that humor back into a caregiving situation is positive because it puts that light spin on life,
100%. And Cynthia, when you were talking about people feeling comfortable about mental health issues, and that's something that we totally address by creating a safe space, right? It's you want to create an environment where people feel comfortable, and it sounds like, Lindsey, you all are addressing this as well, that they can bring their vulnerability, where they're not going to be shamed, where we're all part of, we're humans having a human experience. And once you have that, then of course you also build trust, and you help people want to be at your company and not flee very quickly. So, and Lindsey, I'm wondering if you had anything to add to this.
Yes, definitely. Sherri, you pointing out just even our day-to-day speak, the way that we are articulating the happenings of the day, it can seem like a small thing, but it is very, very powerful. Even coming into a meeting and saying, oh, that was so stressful. That affects everyone in the room. And to be very thoughtful and careful about the words that we're using. And as you mentioned, not to just be a Pollyanna and not to negate maybe the intensity of what everybody is experiencing, addressing it and putting it on the table and talking about it, but also not contributing to adding stress by just kind of venting and just using that speak. The other thing that I wanted to just comment on was the emphasis on education as a portal into having discussions around self-care. And I'm really, really proud that Carlton Senior Living has prioritized education as something for many years. We actually do live in-person training. We have instructors that are on our staff to come into communities, work with caregivers. And whereas most assisted livings have more of a computer type training because we're very regulated with our training, right? So we have this constant vehicle of education that is constantly happening where we sit everyone down, have a connected experience, and we talk about the regulated things we need to talk about. But through that, we can carve out opportunities to also say, how are you doing? How is everything going? And pause and listen. And through the pandemic, it has become a platform for us to insert in all of the other parts of our education that we want to say, such as what Cynthia mentioned, the EAP program, and educating about these wonderful services that are provided to the employees, that if we don't talk about it, they may not know the resources that are out there for them. So I think having that platform of education embedded into the culture, but then livening it up with laughter, with fun, with check-ins, and being able to talk about what's relevant right now for the team and what they need.
Well, so interesting, I have to say, because I just got back from New Rochester, where I have a training that I do. It's 8 tools for self-care and creating connection in cognitive decline, which we just ran at the Jewish Senior Life, which is this huge community in Rochester. And it does have to do with staying present and authenticity, but also focusing on tools like appreciation, which is of course one of the big happiness tools, and not only appreciating others on the staff with you and taking the time to encourage that, but also appreciation of self, you know, and the sacrifices that you're making. So yes, Sherri, go ahead. What did I
Yeah,
say?
I was just going to follow up. I love those comments by Lindsey, and I think, yeah, the education is a big piece, and also, again, to kind of put a different spin on it, like I do a whole library of educational webinars for my employer clients. One of the ones that we do is how to modify your home for an older loved one, not only to be safe, but to really build in from the well building standards that I use, which are about air care, and biophilic design, which is about bringing nature inside, and color psychology. But what we do is we do it like an HGTV makeover show. We go room by room and we have some fun with it, and we show the kind of beautiful, products that are out there now and things. You don't have to buy ugly grab bars. And it really gets a lot of people engaged because now it's not all this downer stuff. It's more like, oh, let's go remake mom's home. But it also touches upon what Cynthia talks about a lot, which is the cost of doing that, helping people understand what are the costs around these types of decisions, and then building in those financial plans along with the other pieces of it.
Yeah, which is interesting. So are there any specific tools? I know you mentioned a few, but if anyone else wants to join in, like some specific tools that can help employers and families actually with their with this stage of life.
Dani, before we go there, if I could
Yeah.
kind of go back a little to what we were just talking about,
Sure.
if you don't mind.
Of course.
We did a study some years back, and I was shocked to find out how many of our working caregivers either have not told their employer that they are a caregiver or do not want their employer to know at all. And the reason for that is that they're afraid of this perception that they are not putting their job first, or that their coworkers might think that they're slacking off and that kind of thing. And I just want to say that more and more employers are starting to create what I call a culture of caring from the top down. And to your point, Lindsey, they're training managers to be sensitive to these individual needs that these working caregivers might have. Things like allowing them to have a flexible schedule. Things like not scheduling meetings at 9 o'clock in the morning when that caregivers, that's typically the time where that working caregiver is having trouble getting out the door and getting into the office or whatever their work environment is. And the other thing about that is your employer cannot know what you need unless you tell them. And they especially don't know if you're not even telling them that you're a caregiver. So one of the things that we need to be aware of is eliminating the stigma from the workplace.
Mhm.
And so that was my answer to the question about what I wish would change within the employers and the community.
Cynthia, can I just say I completely agree. And something I was thinking about prior to us starting today was just how exciting it is that we are beginning to normalize talking about life outside of work in the workplace and being able to talk about, yes, I have other priorities than work. I mean, who would have thought it, right? But that's okay. And how can work support that? And that we can really not only initiate those conversations, but be receptive when someone says, this is important to me. I need, again, going back to that flexibility, I need to maybe take off this afternoon to do X, and we support that. I love how it is being normalized and being prioritized.
Yeah,
Well,
I think that's one of the silver linings of the pandemic, right? Is that we got to see our lives from home.
Yes.
but absolutely, like when you're in, before we all had fancy backgrounds and you were actually in somebody's kitchen or in their living room, or their cat walked across their face, or
Mhm.
their kid was yelling, there was, I used to say there's much less separation of church and state within the work and the person, and that actually has become a positive byproduct of a really awful time. But yes, there's obviously much more concern about mental health and the whole, taking care of the whole person. So
yeah, talking about the byproduct, as an employer that really depends upon having an active pipeline of applicants to come in and work in our environment, we have seen an incredible shift through the pandemic of employees really saying, if I can't have a job with, being able to have emotional well-being, positive mental health, space to have a life outside of work, then I'm not going to work here. And I think that's true in probably all industries, but especially in this industry working with seniors, because it is such an emotionally taxing type of job. And so I think it's really been for employers to answer that call and to stand up and say, if we want to be having a vibrant workforce, we have to provide that as employers. And that's also exciting, where we can have that as one of the top things that we're looking to do for our employees, which is to give them that type of work experience.
okay,
Well, and
Cynthia, go.
I'm sorry, given the shortage of healthcare workers, what you're talking about is not even an option anymore. It's a business imperative. And so the employers, especially in your space that recognize that, are a step ahead of their competitors.
Exactly.
Yeah. I was also going to bring up the loneliness aspect. We know the Surgeon General, right? 1 in 2 American adults are lonely. I do talks all over the country, and caregivers often express, I feel all alone in this journey. And we know loneliness is based on the quality of our relationships, not just that we're socially isolated, but how do we feel about our social I call it the social convoy. Who's traveling with us through life, and who's there for us? And I think, again, to your point, Lindsey and Cynthia, taking away the stigma, but also recognizing that caregivers need a hug, they need support, they need to not feel alone. And we shouldn't force them to be silent, because that's how that exacerbates that feeling. And then we know there's a cascade of health issues that come along with that, as well as not maybe being as well to care for our older loved ones. And Dani, I know what you do with Laughter on Call is a big therapeutic, shot on loneliness.
Yes, yes. And I was just, one of the things that I heard, because, we work in the caregiver space and the corporate space, and not that they're actually that dissimilar, but, that idea of people don't want to commute, right? So they're happy to, now everybody's working from home, right? But the cost of that is you're sitting alone, and something happens, which happens throughout the course of a workday, and there's nobody to turn to and say, can you believe that just happened? And all of those, we don't like to call them weaker ties anymore, which is also really interesting. So Laughter on Call was a case study for Harvard Business School, and I happened to mention the phrase weaker ties. You're not allowed to say that anymore, because they're not so weak, right? What we found out is that they're key ties. They're not weaker ties. And but not having that opportunity to turn to someone, as you said, walking the path. I think I'm paraphrasing you, but not having that because you're feeling isolated. So I think that is the value of creating community. And that is so much of what Laughter on Call comes in and does. Exactly like what you're describing, Lindsey, is we come in, we take the whole team, everybody off the floor, and there's no status, and we're all humans. I mean, that's what laughter does, right? It kind of levels the playing field. And then what happens is people trust each other and can, build a team that wants to be together. So yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I'm wondering, Cynthia, at B of A, what you've experienced in terms of like pre-COVID, post-COVID, and all of that, those changes.
Well, for me personally, the change has been dramatic. I used to travel 75% of the time, and now I work from home. And I am the poster child for having my cat walk across the desk, or my two dogs come in, or you might have beginning of the webcast that my dogs were barking. So whenever I do anything like this, I live in fear that the Amazon delivery man is going to come to my front door because my dogs will just go off the rails. So that's probably the biggest change. I don't travel like that anymore. People aren't doing the events where they're bringing speakers in person, as an example. So where I was traveling to, 3 cities a week all across the country, now I'm traveling once a quarter, which is, I think, is great. But you're absolutely right that you don't have that. I'm 10 seconds from my coffee maker, and in the morning, half the time I haven't even taken pajama bottoms off. So I can stand up now and I don't have them on, but you would never know that about me in the morning, right? But the downside of that, and I consider that a big positive, that I have the convenience of working from a home office. But the downside of that, like you said, Dani, is you have no one to vent to. Something happens that really pulls your chain and you don't have anybody. And, suddenly Skype becomes your best friend because you're venting on Skype. But yeah, I mean, that's a big change. So that's for me personally. Now, from a business perspective, I will tell you that our Parents and Caregivers employee network went from about 7,000 or 8,000 employees, and this is globally. And keep in mind, Bank of America has 250,000 employees around the world. We have 7,000 or 8,000 employees globally. In just those 2 years, we now have close to 24,000 that are part of that Parents and Caregivers network. So that's a big shift since COVID, I would say. And I think COVID's probably 80% to blame for that.
And I'm just curious, what does that network offer them? Just like people to connect with, or their training or support groups, or how does that work?
All of the above. It's a support group. It's a way to make connections with people that have like circumstances. But it's also education. As a matter of fact, today we wound up our 4-day global expo that we do annually, and it's 4 days of educational sessions with various experts on parenting and caregiving. We were very fortunate this year. We had Joe Coughlin from the MIT Age Lab, who spoke on AI in the caregiving world and how that's going to change moving forward. So it's education across the broad spectrum of topics, as well as that it really is, we call it an employee network. It's really an employee support group.
And I'm curious, is there, and this is for everyone, is there a specific department now that's been created that specifically addresses, I mean, I guess it would fall under the umbrella of HR, but is there something more specific that's focused on that?
On networks or I'm sorry, go ahead, Lindsey.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, within our organization, we do have a department that is dedicated to education. And again, that can be utilized for regulatory circumstances, but also things like this as well. Yeah, and it is under.
Yeah, and in my experience working with employers, it really is dependent upon what the employee needs are. The employers are really the ones that say, we want to create this group. They go to HR to kind of get official, I think, recognition and maybe even a little bit of budget. because I do a lot of my talking engagements and speaking engagements and workshops are with a lot of these employee resource groups that are related to caregiving, but there's other topics as well. So it brings employees together on like-minded, life challenges or situations, and, they're supported then from the corporate level.
Yeah, it's really interesting because consistently all of this is saying like human connection, like that it's all in support of human connection. All right, speaking of which, we do have some questions in the chat. I guess it's for everyone. Are there any tools or tactics that haven't worked or are struggling to get traction?
May I just say, the devil's advocate to these support groups is that sometimes people aren't ready to say, I need support. So although we need to have that, we need to have those groups for the people that are ready. But I think that you can have layers to it because it may not work for everyone, right? And so just kind of going back to something I said earlier about having that live training, it's live training. You have to come to training. But if you can build into that, which is a connected environment with a group of people, and essentially offer some of those supportive services embedded into those types of those, integrated moments for everyone, that can ease people into the supportive environment. So I think for organizations that are thinking, okay, I'm just going to start a support group and I'm just going to do these things, they may not see immediate turnout. So we just have to build into that as an organization.
Yeah,
I
so
think
go Sherri, I'll go after you. Go ahead.
I was just going to say the thing that I've really seen with a lot of my employer clients are twofold. One is that typically if you have a champion within the company, particularly at the C-suite level, right, at the very top, then you're going to have more support for caregiving groups and caregiving activities and maybe even services and programs. The other thing too is a consistency in communication, because one of the things we have to recognize is that 6 months ago, you may not have been a caregiver for your mom or dad, but now you are. And so if you think it's a one and done, okay, we'll do one webinar a year, that isn't really flowing with the life, impact that a lot of the employees are having who all of a sudden come into caregiving or start to think more about it. And so that's where keeping up that communication, the education around what can be done and what is there for you as a support is really critical, I think, for employers.
Yeah, I had two thoughts about that actually. My first thought, which I had earlier, is like, I'm wondering if there could be an anonymous hotline or some anonymous way for, C-suite people to get this information until the stigma is lessened, and for people who feel like sharing that is going to compromise their authority or their level of commitment, if there was a way for them to communicate anonymously about that. And then in terms of reticence to, participate in mental health and mental wellness, that's so much of what we face when we show up and we're like, we're going to laugh, everyone. And now we're going to do an icebreaker. And then inevitably there's someone who's like, I would rather throw up than do this. and that's happened more than once. But interestingly, once you create an environment that's safe, that where no one's going to be made fun of, and we make that so clear, and people feel like they can bring their authentic self, it's amazing. Then those very people who were reticent end up being leaders, because I think they feel such a sense of relief. Mm-hmm. So I completely agree that it's in how it's handled. And for us, any kind of sarcasm, nothing cutting, there's no place for that. I mean, I guess I've gotten old because I don't think there's any place for that. I really like, like comedy should make you feel better, right? Than how you felt before. Okay.
I was just going to add on the anonymous feedback. We at Carlton, we do have an employee platform. It's very much like social media, but it's just within the employee base. But we have an ability for employees to anonymously give any sort of feedback, and it is able to go to the senior leadership. I think the key here is to ensure that there is follow-up, because it's hard when it's anonymous. You don't even know who to follow up with. So you have to also then have the next step, which is an ability to broadcast the answer, versus it goes off into the abyss and no one ever hears about it. And so that was something that we learned, is that we need to ensure that people feel heard after they give that feedback.
I guess I didn't think about the downside of the anonymity. Is that right? How do you contact trace the anonymous person?
Yeah, but you can do that, especially if it's just in that broad communication to say, we're hearing this, this is what we're thinking. And, we're not obviously calling out to a certain person. It goes back to having that open communication. And as Sherri pointed out, having continuous communication that is ongoing at all times. It's not silence for 6 months and then we pop up and say something. We're just always talking, always integrating whatever is, having our finger on the pulse for whatever employees need to hear.
Yeah, and I do think if you create a culture where people are talking about their challenges, and with solutions, right? Not wallowing. Then when that person does 6 months down the line find themselves in that circumstance, they feel like it's okay to let everyone know. So it's really about creating these different cultures. Yeah, Sherri.
And I think too, part of what I brought up in my book, which is a big theme, is that, again, we do apply certain stigma to things, even like mental health, even though there's so much more talk about it, there's so much more support for it. There still is a stigma for the individual, I think, sometimes around mental health. So again, can we reframe these things where it's not maybe about mental health, but we're going to help encourage brain health? We're going to help you understand how your brain works and how we can encourage better brain health. Or instead of burnout, we're going to help you with life balance. We're going to give you some techniques or a workshop or whatever, because that's a more positive, and it also gives you back agency rather than having to acknowledge I have a problem that needs to be solved. Now, instead, it's like, we're going to help you build some strengths in life. We're going to help focus on that. And I think that, again, those little nuances really do play out, and I've seen it in the workshops that I've done using that type of language. But I think talking about life balance is something all of us are looking for. We're not just caregivers, right? But it takes away that stigma on some of these topics, I think.
Yeah, I love that idea of getting ahead of it before it becomes a mental health crisis. And of course, again, laughter, right? That's why we come in and try to get ahead of it, get people talking right away. Cynthia, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the question around can you point to something that didn't work? As I'm thinking about that, I think first of all, you can lead a horse to water, right? But you can't make them drink. And so something that you think may not be working may actually be working down the road. And I say that in this context. Each of you had mentioned being there when you're needed. And so someone who is not in that situation at this time might not think that, there's anything there for them. However, if you do what I would call a drip campaign, if everybody is informed that all of this is out there, then you are there when you need them. They'll remember when they have that situation come up that they have that support within the workplace. And so, you may be leading them to water, but they might not be thirsty at that point, but they might get thirsty later.
Yeah, 100%. You're just reminding me. So for like a year when my mother was in the beginning journey, I did stand up about Alzheimer's. Like I would go to clubs and do stand up about Alzheimer's. And I didn't get a lot of laughs. Who are we kidding? Because I was in like regular comedy clubs. And so I would always say, because I'm very young, so I would say, I know this isn't landing yet, but take notes. You're going to get there. And consequently, I feel like I kind of in my peer group, I kind of have become the go-to person because I went through it first. They know that they're safe to talk to me about whatever's coming up and that I'm going to have information. And I think that's basically what you're saying on the grander scale of a culture is to just establish yourselves as a resource. And then as these numbers escalate, which, we can't hear enough about, people will know, right, that they have a place to go. So these are, even things like this, like a forum of like women talking honestly about what it means. And you know what, Cynthia, could you share some of those ideas about the caregivers, the people that are being taken advantage of, which I know is a little bit off topic, but was so fascinating to me. And I think also, Sherri, since you do, and actually Lindsey too, for that matter, you all deal with people in cognitive decline and how vulnerable they are. And I know, Sherri, you're like building homes that are, cognitively challenged friendly. So anyway, Cynthia, that's a big setup for you.
So, it's not my favorite topic to talk about, but it's a reality. More and more seniors, especially those that have some kind of cognitive impairment, even if it's not full-blown Alzheimer's or other dementias, are becoming victims to scams and financial exploitation. And part of the problem is that many of the actual perpetrators of this are family members, are caregivers. And so, how do you differentiate, and because especially after COVID, the loneliness factor is causing these numbers to rise, because older people who are lonely are going to become, are much more easily giving over their trust. It's a lot easier to get into their inner circle and have access to various things, including their bank accounts. So one thing I would tell you is, as a caregiver, I think it's and as a family of someone who needs care, it is your obligation to educate yourselves about the signs of elder abuse in all of its ugly forms, as well as financial exploitation, which is obviously a form of abuse. Things like, try to, if you have a loved one who can't manage their finances, or maybe is making poor financial decisions, see if you can become not necessarily a signer on their accounts, but if you can gain access to their statements, so that you can look at their monthly statements and see if there's been excessive transactions or unusual transactions. Your grandmother charges $500 on a credit card, and all of a sudden she's charging $5,000 at a jewelry store. That's kind of an unusual transaction that would send a red flag. So, if you can educate yourselves on the signs of all of these types of abuse, and just be on the lookout. And then the other thing I would say on it, and I'm sure Lindsey and Sherri, you'll want to jump in here, but the other thing I would say too is do not be afraid to report. If you think something is happening, it's much better to report it than it is to ignore it, if you're interested in keeping that loved one safe. So I'll stop there. I did just release a paper on financial exploitation. If anybody wants to get their hands on it, they can feel free to email me, and I'll send it over.
Yeah. I just found it so fascinating, so much of that, but also that it's family members, that you have to really pay attention. And I was, I was always struck when my mother was she was in two different communities, and, the how ill prepared a lot of offspring are, and the tension. And I'm sure you see this, Lindsey, like one of my, jokes is like, how are you? Good? You're good? Everything's good. You look good, Mom. It's good. And it's like, oh my, like they just, getting people to be present and really take it in, not gloom and doom, but to be authentic. And that's how this whole Laughter on Call thing even started, was because I brought a comedian in, and she was authentic. And I think it like so surprised my mother that it made her laugh. And so, but I do think, Lindsey, that was an interesting point you made earlier about not going so far into the gloom and doom, like being authentic, being honest, but then not brutally honest, right? Yeah. That's a big distinction that I always like to make. And
even using, an old-fashioned cliche term of the sandwich method. But if you think about it, just in that concept of starting the conversation out positively and taking a moment to dip into reality, and recognize whatever maybe needs to be recognized, but ensuring that you have a way out, so that that's not where the end of the conversation ends, that you can not mask the issue and say, oh, but everything's fine, but to maybe end that with a resource, a next step. But again, just ensuring that our language is not promoting the doom and gloom. Because even though it's important to speak about how we're feeling and to have that opportunity to vent and get it out, we also don't want to just put that on others and live in this negativity at all times. Nobody can exist in that, right?
Yeah. And I was going to add to what Cynthia was talking about. I'm sure her paper probably covers this, but I've been interviewed on, grandparent scams and the romance scams with older adults.
Yeah.
And I think it's incumbent again upon our family caregivers and those of us in our families to really educate ourselves. It goes back to education. Know what these things are. I mean, AI is terrific, but AI is now being used to voice clone a grandchild's voice to use in a grandparent scam. And there are some romance scams among our lonely seniors where they're literally losing their homes because they're signing over so much, of their house or their mortgage or depleting their savings. And so that is going to impact us as families. And so we are part of this, right? I mean, part of what I write about in my book are the 7 elements of life. Financial wellness with Cynthia is one of them, but the social wellness, and we are all connected, and it is what helps us thrive. It's things like laughter and that connectivity, but it's also we're connected in terms of what happens with our loved ones impacts our lives as well, and we can't just disengage from that, I think.
Okay, I can't.
And one more
ask.
point on
Go
that.
ahead. I have to make the grandkid. Steve,
Yeah,
is
really quickly. Also, these topics from the point of view of your care recipient, because many times they're not going to tell you what's going on because they're afraid that it's going to impact their independence. So you want to make sure that you have a solution that is not threatening for them.
Well, and these romance scammers, I'm sorry, now I'm going to jump, now I'm going to get all kind of crazy on this, but they are so awful because, very often they're sitting in another country and it's not even the person that they say they are, but they're convincing the older senior, you know me, we know each other, don't tell anyone about us. It's just it's our, they really prey upon that sense of you want somebody to be there for you and be your person. It's just awful, it's just.
I can just say, in assisted living, obviously everyone that works in assisted living is a mandated reporter legally, but also your culture, going back to culture helps with that so much. And I know within our organization, we actually train that everyone here obviously as a mandated reporter, we go into that, but we say you are a lifeguard. And it began when we were just looking at, choking in the dining room, things like that. Always be scanning, always be looking, but we're promoting the fact that we are here to help and be protectors and support at all times. And just ensuring that that is something that's being discussed can really help with this problem.
Okay, this is amazing. All right, but in respect for what Lindsey said about the sandwich, we got to be positive here. So I have you have 2 choices. What's your hope? What is a sign of hope for all of these multi-millions that are coming our way? Or what do you do personally to keep the burnout at bay? So whoever wants to jump in.
I'll take the personal one. I get up every morning at 5 o'clock and I am taking Pilates either at 6 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock in the morning, every morning. And that sets me up for my day. It gets the endorphins going. It keeps me positive. And so I would encourage, if you can start your day with exercise, that's been the best thing I've ever done.
Awesome. And you must have a fabulous core.
That's
a lot of core. Fantastic. All right. Who else?
Well, I can
go ahead. Right, Lindsey.
No. Mine is similar to Cynthia's actually. So I'll take the other question. My hope is that as we proceed forward, that we continue to see our seniors, but also our employees as individuals. And we don't just communalize everyone and just assume that everyone has the same needs, the same mindset, that we can really individualize experiences, relationships, and needs. And I really do believe that we are on that track, especially after the pandemic, which has put a great focus on that.
Yes. Okay. Sherri.
I'm going to bring the 2 together because the research that I put into my book, I had to follow myself because I can't recommend something that, I haven't done. But what really, I think, fascinated me is that if you dig into, first of all, your brain health and you go back to what we call the ancient brain, which is when we lived out on the African savanna and we were out in fresh air and we saw blue skies and we saw beautiful mosaic of trees and greenery. and maybe even some florals, and we knew there was water source and food sources there, that still exists within all of our brains. We have all this modern technology and all these things that take up so much of our thinking, but we really comfort ourselves and soothe ourselves when we can have a non-cluttered environment, have greenery that we can see or bring inside, that multi-sensory environment. The way that I do things and it just takes a few minutes, by the way. It's not, you don't all have to get out and do an hour's worth of workout or whatever. It can be just a few minutes a day or even during the week to listen to beautiful music, to daydream by staring out a window at a snowfall or the autumn leaves changing, to smell the sense of Thanksgiving and everything that's coming up with the holidays. All of those things are great for brain health, and it's good for our older loved ones, and it's good for us in terms of bringing this balance back. And I also talk about harnessing the four feel-good hormones, which I call the four hormones against the apocalypse. And it's what Cynthia was saying, it's endorphins, it's that pain relief hormone, it's oxytocin, which, Dani, you get from being with somebody, laughing, touching, looking into their eyes. That's a love, trust, bonding hormone. Serotonin is a mood boost hormone. And then, of course, we have dopamine, which is our reward hormone. If we can learn how to harness those hormones to work for us, it's going to help a lot with that burnout, with that mental health, and bringing life back into balance.
I mean, Sherri, you're singing my song. That's the whole laughter. Those are the four ones that we talk about. And more oxygen to the lungs. How about that one?
Yeah.
All right, we have to let these very busy, talented women go. But I mean, what an amazing resource, just this webinar. If you need financial advice, go to Cynthia. If you want to feng shui your house for the Alzheimer's world, call Sherri. And Lindsey, big plug for Carlton. I got to say, Lindsey, you're very on the cutting edge there in terms of bringing humanity and retention and staving off burnout. So it's been delightful, and I'm so honored that we were all able to be here and have this very important conversation. That was kind of fun too. So anyone who wants to reach out, just we'll have the notes for where you can reach all these women. And thank you for spending your time with us at lunch or a cocktail if you're on the East Coast. And we'll see you all again for the next one in the new year.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.